guys, welcome back to my channel, and in today's video I'll be doing my reading wrap up for the month of April. In April I feel like my reading was a bit of everywhere. There were some things that were amazing and there were also some things that were not that great. So overall not the best reading month, but pretty well balanced in the end. In April I read 6 books and the genre breakdown was 3 classics, 1 African fiction, 1 fantasy and 1 non-fiction. So the first book that I read in April was Giovannis Room by James Baldwin. This was my first 5-star book of the month, so clearly it was an amazing book that resonated with me in so many different ways. I enjoyed this book immensely to the point where I just had to give it 5 stars because it was so emotionally beautiful. For the basic plot of this book, we are following David, and he is a young man in his mid-20s and he has fled from America to Paris in order to find himself. And David is someone who is kind of not very responsible, and so he doesn't really take up a job while he's in Paris, and he kind of makes friends with certain men in order to, if he ever is in a pinch, help fund his lifestyle. And David doesn't view himself as a gay man or even as like leading these men on, because he has this like sort of weird sense of self-belief that he operates on, which allows him to simultaneously surround himself with these men and like be in these places but exploit these men as well, and be aware of the dynamic that they are in, but still somehow he's able to tell himself that he's not a homosexual man and that he isn't attracted to men and that he isn't like other men, etc., etc. So David is, through one of these benefactors he has, comes across another young man from Italy called Giovanni, and as time goes on, Giovanni and David start up a relationship, and we just follow the relationship between David and Giovanni as he essentially rejects Giovanni as much as he can whilst still savoring the amazing person that Giovanni is. We internally toil with David in his shame and hatred whilst he exploits Giovanni for the love and attention and amazing person that Giovanni is. The tone of this book is very heavy, very dark, very painful, very much shame. There's like a lot of shame in this book, and it's not an easy read. It's honestly heartbreaking to read. If you've been through something similar to this, it makes it incredibly relatable, but also just incredibly sad. I enjoyed it. I felt very, very sad, and it was incredibly well written, beautiful. Like some of the things that Giovanni said linger in my brain, like such beautiful things, and honestly just interrogating the results of like contention within a human and societal pressure, and how that can result in cruelty, not only to yourself but to other people who truly do not deserve it, and how this pain can like take shape of its own, and the results of that in the end. It's an interesting question of like who's actually to blame. Of course David and his actions and his insecurities, but we also got a bit of background into David and his own upbringing. This book is iconic because it deals so intimately with shame. Of course this book exists for homosexual men, but this book is deeply relatable because I feel like shame is such a common issue that we deal with as humans, and romantic shame, and this book is just beautiful in how it deals with these themes. And as we're reading the book, we are aware of how things end, so we know that the tragedy that occurs, so it kind of helps prepare us. But once we get to that point of like fully understanding the intricate details of the situation that led to the ending, it just is deeply painful. So this is a classic novel, but I feel like it also can be categorized as a literary fiction, but because it was written a long time ago, and like it is part of the Penguin Modern Classic collection, but it is extremely character driven. And I think one of the things that this book does really well is that it challenges the idea of societal expectations on the self and how we can deny the thing that we probably need the most, the thing that makes us the most happy, in order to fill this societal obligation. It broke my heart into a million pieces, but I'm so happy that I read it. I was so excited to read it because I've heard amazing things about it, but this book was just one of the best. The next book that I read in April was Critical But Stable by Angela Makholwa. This was my book club pick, and I actually had never heard about this before. It is a fictional story that is following a group of couples that are part of a stokvel, or like a money collecting society, but also because they are like wealthy South Africans, there is also an aspect of like showing off and showing out within their community. So within the community, we witness the drama that is happening in the private lives of each couple, and we kind of delve slightly into individual characters and their little bits of unhappiness despite the glitz and glam of that they show to the outside world. I feel like the goal of this book was to sort of kind of interrogate certain South African problems, but also to like entertain in terms of like a bit of mockery / flattery on the upper crust 1% Black South African population. So for a bit of a synopsis of this novel, we have a lot of couples, but I'll just delve into 3 of them. The Manamelas, they are an older couple which has a husband who has made his wealth in an illegal way, and he's propositioned again to continue on in that business that he's given up. And his wife, who was also came from illegal backgrounds, but she's now made herself her own. She's gone from being a trophy wife to being a businesswoman, and her husband's not really happy with that. Then we also have another couple which is dealing with financial problems, and another couple which is dealing with problems in the bedroom. The husband does not want to engage in that marital contract anymore. And we basically follow various tiny events that happen in their lives. So my rating of the book is 3.5 stars. I want to be kind because this is a South African author, but I also found funny, but I also feel like it lacked a lot of depth in the story, and that's why it's hard for me to even speak about what the goal of the book is or even the synopsis. So because it was so disjointed, I feel like she's trying to explore a lot of themes in terms of like the xenophobia crisis and like the illegal versus legitimate work, and then also like marital problems like in the bedroom, and then marital problems with lying about money, and also just like gay marriage in South Africa. But it's all very loosely touched on, so it kind of feels very disjointed. I will say the writing was very easy to follow, and it didn't bother me too much. It made sense, it was easy to follow, and I found it to be enjoyable in the sense that I had a pleasant reading experience. And I think ultimately what impressed me about this book is that I was genuinely laughing at multiple points whilst reading this book, and I think that's very rare because I don't really laugh while I'm reading. Like, I don't like to laugh at all. I hate comedy. So me cracking up laughing while reading this was just like insane. But after the first half of the novel, the plot became incredibly messy and the storylines were so underdeveloped. This book had many couples, more than I described, and then the couples had children and they had friends and like lots of characters and lovers and things like that. So lots of characters, but like each storyline didn't get a clear ending. I feel like the novel relied on the characters and building the personalities of the characters instead of like, okay, now we know that there's this rich man who hates that his wife is thriving and he has a history of hiding that he's rich. Okay, cool, now we have that character, but like now what are you going to do with him? And not a lot gets done with the characters, so that's kind of disappointing. I'm happy that I read a South African novel, but this wasn't my favorite. The next book that I read in April was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, and this is a classic, I believe. Again, it's part of Penguin's vintage line, so I'm going to count it as a classic novel. And this book follows various families living in post-depression Ohio, So we follow the Breedloves, which is Makhola's family. And then we also follow another family in the same neighborhood, Claudia, and we kind of delve sort of semi-deeply into both families, but mostly into the Breedloves. That's the family that we focus on the most. And Makholwa is a young girl whose parents met and fell in love, but now have kind of fallen into the rhythm of this like dysfunctional relationship. Makhola's father does not take care of them, so Makholwa ends up staying with Claudia's family for a little bit. Once their families reunited again, Makholwa goes through a horrific event at the hands of her father, which kind of sent her into a spiral, which of course she was already dealing with so many issues of self-worth, but the event that happens to her kind of solidifies her fate in a sense. I read this book because I've heard so many good things about this book. Honestly, it's a very well-known novel, and I had read Song of Solomon earlier in the year, so I was really excited to pick this one up. I know that Toni Morrison is a Nobel laureate author, and she has written books primarily focusing on the African American experience. Even though I'm not African American, I feel like I still can relate to a lot of the things that she speaks about in this novel and in her work in general. It's incredibly beautiful, reflective, and deep, like very deeply nuanced. If you are someone who, you don't need to be black, but if you understand in some rudimentary sense the black experience, I think you would appreciate the ways in which Toni Morrison is able to accurately discuss the different beauties and struggles that black people go through. And that's primarily what I liked about this book, is the discussions around worth as a black person, and around respectability, and around existing as a black person, and having this inherent self-hatred, and I think themes of like self-hatred and your worth, and also hypocrisy, and also just like childish wonder of being so desperate, and the many ways that a child can think their problems will be solved. It's like Makholwa being a young girl and living a life filled with people hating her because of her hair, because of her skin, and she is able to understand that other young girls that don't look like her have certain graces that she's not allowed. And instead of like understanding that this is because I'm black and historically this is the reason, and etc., she rather, with her own like childish wonder, says that she wants to have blue eyes, so I think that was a really interesting point of dealing with how children react to unfavorable circumstances like racism. But I feel like this book is just even more than just the blue eyes. There's a lot of what happened in this book that really stands out for me is the conversation around generational trauma stemming from the mother, the father, the daughter, the son, just this passing down of pain, and the root of it just being steadily brought. And it's like the role that racism has played in that generational trauma. The mother taking on a job and having to take on this persona of like abandoning her own children in order to feel pride, and the father having his moment of humiliation and mockery again. And then also the daughter understanding that she is not being treated the same way as other people, and again, all of that is like at the hands of racism. So it's like really, really interesting exploration, and I really enjoy the juxtaposition that Toni does within this novel of like the poem, I guess you could say, the little passage that she has in the beginning where she's talking about like the perfect family and the perfect house and the cat and the dog and the like the perfect life. There are a lot of moments where we get to compare like, oh, like this doll looks like this and this doll deserves that, and you only get this when you deserve this. So it's like juxtaposing the expectation of what life should be, how people should be treated and the reality of African American people. And again, the ending of the story was incredibly sad. It made sense to just like fall into that state of like delirium, because it's like, what does the system expect from you? I feel like the atmosphere of this book was overwhelmingly devastating. This book is not filled with happiness or hopefulness. I mean, there are like tidbits of like very unique African American culture, but I feel like it's more exploring the underbelly. So like even judgment amongst women in the town. There's a lot of things that are explored in here, but they're all of like a more tragic nature, and like fear of your parents. Like all of it is quite bleak, you know. There's not really like celebration at all in this novel, and of course it doesn't need to have it. This is Toni Morrison's debut novel, which is incredibly impressive, but considering the fact that I had read Song of Solomon, I feel like the writing is 100% different in this one. You can tell that as her work has gone on, she becomes more able to effectively hit the points that she wants to hit. I feel like this novel made a lot of beautiful points, but there were some times where I was confused with what was trying to be said. So I think over time she definitely hones her voice, but this is still a stunning debut. So the next book that I read in April was The Crucible by Arthur Miller, and this is a play about the Salem, Massachusetts witch trials that happened in 1692. I really enjoyed this play. I thought that it was interesting. It was such a beautiful exploration of moral panic and sort of like human nature, in the sense of like being expressed through a religious context that is inherently suspicious of women, of women's wants, of women's desires, and I feel like this book is a really interesting exploration of, from multiple angles, the annihilation of women from the institution of the church, the institution of the court and the state, and from other women as well, in order to save themselves. Such a very interesting portrayal of like it's a great example of the avalanche of gets caused by a singular event and how hysteria spreads so easily. And this book felt like such a delicious exploration of the religious framework and the religious mind and the way of religious thinking. And it's honestly so scary to think that there was a time in which the suspicions of religion were like allowed in the court, you know, like there wasn't any sort of due process. It was just like the overcoming of a religious spirit kind of served as the proof enough, you know. And that was it was scary to see. And it's kind of like this insane game of pointing fingers at whoever the spotlight was on. I really enjoyed this book. I found it to be super informative. I did not know much about the Salem witch trials, so I liked it, and I enjoyed reading it. The person who would enjoy this book is someone maybe who enjoys law, enjoys anything. It's not a feminist novel, but it is interesting to see how women were treated. Or also if you just enjoy dissecting religious structures and religious beliefs and the history of moving from a world in which religion was allowed in law. If you're someone who's interested in that, I think you would definitely enjoy this book. And I also have this amazing Penguin 20th Century edition of The Crucible. This is my first Penguin 20th Century, and I think I want to start collecting them. I feel like it seems like it's from November of 1989, which is crazy because it's in such good condition. The next book that I read in April was The Invisible Life of Addie La Rue. I guess we can call this my flop of the month. I believe I gave this 2 stars, so not one of my favorites. This is a fantasy novel. I don't usually read fantasy, but sometimes it's really good, and then other times it's like also really bad, so it's very hit or miss with me. And for the synopsis, I actually did a video reading this book, so I'm going to be very quick with this, but the synopsis is that we follow a young woman named Addie La Rue, and she is living in 18th century France, and she wants to avoid having to marry a man, so she makes a deal with the devil to live forever but to be remembered by no one. We follow her for 300 years as she finally eventually meets someone who can remember her. And I think my main questions were like, the character of Addie is not believable, the story was not enjoyable for me, and the writing was verbose. It felt too long of a book. It's like over 500 pages. It just wasn't my novel. I'm struggling to say what I appreciated, but I think there are a lot of, in certain ways, if you look at this book, there are some ways to appreciate things being that could have been said in terms of like existing as a woman in society. In order to have freedom, you have to quite literally be invisible. That's the only way that a woman can gain freedom in society. But Addie's character, what she did with that freedom, it didn't really translate for me. I feel like the vibe of the book was very much repetitive, very, very repetitive, and I understand Addie has lived 300 years, so her life is repetitive, but it then became this sort of like appreciation of art, and I love art, but it was like art in terms of a woman existing only as a muse, and I found that to be disheartening. I know she had limitations due to her curse, but it just felt so opposed to the idea of like gaining freedom only to become a muse. Just didn't really impress me. But I have this amazing hardcover copy, so I guess that makes up for it. If you want to, you can check out my reading vlog for this book. The last book that I read in April was by Bessel van der Kolk. This book is incredibly popular and well known across like the internet. A lot of people know about this book. A lot of people have heard about this book. It is probably one of the most popular trauma books out right now, and being that it is so well known and beloved by some, I expected a really, really good book. I've honestly heard about this book for years and years and years. Like, the term "the body keeps the score" is just on its own, like outside of the book, is incredibly prolific and well known. I feel like it's sort of like, in terms of the trauma space, it's like the atomic habits of the trauma space. So I really wanted to see what I could get out of this book. This book is essentially an exploration of trauma, focusing primarily on childhood trauma as the most resistant form of trauma, and it is a scientific study and exploration of the ways in which physically and neurologically the body and the mind are affected by various traumas occurring at different ages. The main distinction is adult trauma versus childhood trauma, and he goes in depth in terms of like the brain areas that are affected, and also how that manifests in terms of like behavior. And then he also delves into solutions and different methodologies for healing. He's not anti-big pharma, but he is more pro actually dealing with the root cause instead of like. I was also inspired to read this book because of another book that I had read called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. Gabor and Bessel are like in the same circles, and Gabor actually mentioned the body keeps the score at least once or twice in his novels, so that was another reason, that was another thing that inspired me to read this book. If I was to quickly compare The Myth of Normal and The Body Keeps the Score, I feel like The Myth of Normal, it does go into health-wise, like the effects of trauma, but I feel like it offers less solution-based. It's more of like, you're gonna die if you're traumatized, but this is more like, it has more of like a scientific backing from my point of view, but I enjoyed both novels. Also, like, another thing that was very interesting about this book was the mention of IFS. I read another book last year called No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz, I believe, and that book was amazing, and he kind of had a section on IFS, so it's like super amazing to read about IFS again. I really do love that methodology of therapy. So I think overall the book went in the direction of a very deep dive into trauma, and a lot of what was mentioned constantly was like the various studies that Bessel has been doing across the field in terms of trauma, and it is very inspiring. This book was incredibly informative and very difficult to read. There were some parts that honestly left me near tears because they were just incredibly relatable, but also just painful. Like, I know it's easy to sit back and say, oh, I'm traumatized, but like to actually deal with it and to have that emotion in front of you, and to have the effects of that emotion, and to understand like on a scientific level the effects of trauma, it's difficult. It is difficult, but I'm super grateful that I finished this. I enjoyed this book. I feel smarter for reading this book, and that's why I like reading, to become smarter. So I definitely think that this was a really nice book to read. And with that being said, those are all the books that I read in April. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye.